Oh, you're so funny. Sorry, hello, this is Werewolf the podcast, introduced by me and... Oh, I keep forgetting. They can't hear you. Yeah. You're invisible, remember? Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like a telepathic link that we have. No. I'll explain to them. Yeah, Fen is the other part of the duo, and he is my wolf, so we combine together to form the werewolf. Oh, we did that together and you wouldn't have heard, would you? He just wanted more input into the werewolf podcast, but obviously he can't because you can't hear him or see him or do any of those things. So, sorry, Fen. If you'd like to join a Facebook group or follow me on Twitter or Instagram or any of those other things, there is plenty of links down in the description. You could even buy me a coffee if you wanted, and I would just like to say thank you to everyone who has supported me so far. It's been amazing to think that just this horrible life that I live could be so celebrated. Let's move on. We're on part 2 of the ballerina and the werewolf. Hopefully you listened to ballerina 1. I don't think you really have to though. You could just listen to ballerina 2 if you wanted. But anyway, to carry on. Ballerina.
The world was on fire and no one can save me but you. Strange what desire can make foolish people.
Perfect smooth skin is in the cleft of her hip. My finger sweeps its path along this route from here to the promise. I bend to her hip bone and gently nip with my teeth. She giggles with pleasure as she turns to her front, her weight on her elbows, her head lifted. That body is holy and unholy as I soak in the vista that she presents. She turns towards me as I sit on the bed and smiles. I'm speechless. Not often a problem of mine, but the more I try to communicate the picture I see to her, the more I realise that language was never enough to describe this. Just this. I look at her eyes as she lies upon the crisp white sheets. They hold pleasure and passion. Her mouth is slightly open as she controls her breathing. Lust is on her. She wants to douse its fire. A wish to explore and wander on the edges of her personal limits, to push them with this handsome stranger, this man with whom she has no relationship that would limit her exploration of her wants and needs. She does not need to worry about stepping beyond his bounds, as he is only a tool to find her true limits. She has a million scenarios in her mind that she could never even voice to the one she actually loved, the one she cares for and is cared for by. She needs a man in this case who does not care and can push her beyond her mental confines. She wants to cross her fetid sexual frontiers and not care about the judgment she may receive. She'll only be judged by this one, who she will never meet again. She will never consider him. His needs or wants are not part of the next few hours. It's all about her and what she wants and can take. This is the lamb before the hungry wolf, innocent to the predator. She's never had the fortune to meet a predator like me, to learn of its avarice and wants. She thinks she's in a safe place, secure and able to explore. The wolf smiles. I rise from the bed. I'm naked and raise a hand towards her, inviting her to follow me. She coyly takes the proffered hand and rises from the bed. She presents her body as she lightly steps forward. Her footing is perfect. Each step and movement is a thing of beauty. A chair sits alone in the centre of the room. Above it is a point in the ceiling where a small hoop is secured. I lead her to the seat and ask her to sit. No words, just shepherd the lamb to the place she will be. She takes the seat and I place her hands palm down on her thighs and step back to look. I just spend a moment to take a mental photograph of the before. The room is large. 3 walls are white and 1 is mirrored. There is a bed and 2 chairs. and that is all the room contains. Kim found this amusing when she arrived. Now she understands it's a room to focus on one thing, and one thing only. Her thoughts on that thing differ vastly from mine, but I wouldn't be foolish enough to dissuade her of her voiced assumption. I smile at her and show her some level of approval of what I see. She is insecure and needs reassurance to display any level of confidence. We've done the adult things of discussing what was going to happen, what she wanted, and what I was going to provide for her. We've laid down what is appropriate and what is not. She knows at any time she can stop. She just has to voice the words given. I tell her to wait a moment, only raising a finger and making eye contact. No voice. I turn my back to her as I make my way to the mirrors to show her what is stored behind those sheets of glass. I slide the doors past each other to show her my toys, a wall of the Dom's tools, his weapons in devotion to his art. I turn to see her face as she looks at the presented items, a well-organised cornucopia of things that range from feathers to steel studs. She is fascinated by the items before her, and I see her muscles engage in her thighs. She wants to come and touch my things, to finger my fine goods and see what is available. That's not up to her, and I demand her to sit by pointing a stabbing finger and shaking my head in a no. A look of sadness briefly passes over her face, and then she realizes this sternness and reproach are at the centre of her needs. Kim is not in control at all in this situation. This man is, and she will do as she is told, and she will inconceivably enjoy that he is. I have a warm feeling. Each time she follows these little instructions, she becomes less able to say no to me. It becomes natural just to follow the things requested. I am training her to give herself wholly to me and have no conscious choice to do anything else. Sweet meat that is giving itself gladly to the beast within me that needs the feed. Let me do the flashback thing at this point to earlier in the evening. Yeah, I know it was just getting good, but you know I'm a complete cunt and do this kind of shit often just because I can. Oh, and you might be asking where my wolf soul posit Fen is at this moment. Why is he not in the room? He hasn't even been mentioned. He's downstairs with Malcolm in a huff. I think they're rewatching Buffy at the moment. He's a big fan of Spike for some unknown reason. We arrived at my home in Manchester by taxi. I own a large warehouse down by the canal. There is some information for those who will try to locate me, but not enough to do so. And let's be honest, with my sensibilities, I may well be lying. Would I do that? Well, the apparent answer from the stories I tell you is yes. Come on, this shit I spout is obviously made up, is it not? A real werewolf. I'd walked her through my garage of vehicles. She was fascinated by them. I had to tell her the story of each and found out that as a young girl, she'd helped Dad, a taciturn conservative, fix up vehicles that he bought to sell on. This was important for her to share, as it seemed to be the only interaction with this emotionally stunted man who wanted a son, but got 3 daughters and did not know what to do with girls. So he hid in the garage to bring peace. He had got his almost son in Kim, an oily little mischievous tomboy. I let her tell me her story. In sharing these things, she moved through levels of rapport from inane small talk to intimate shared secrets. I took pleasure, not from the stories, but from how she drove deeper into my grasp. Seeing this small creature bind herself to this seemingly caring man was almost inspiring. She'd watched too many romantic comedies. This was not Pretty Woman or Bridget Jones' Diary. It's definitely the wrong genre of film, sadly. As we entered my 3rd floor apartment from the lift, she was stunned into silence. I believe in minimalism as an ideal. My home is immaculately maintained by my living caretaker, who you may have heard about in the past. Malcolm is my personal pedo that I hold as a hostage due to his particular wants and needs. It's easy. Every item in the home that is visible is only there because it is a thing of beauty. Charles Rennie Mackintosh is represented there. Charlotte Perriand there. I would deeply describe the pieces and the aesthetic beauty that I find in them, but I know that is not why you're listening. Maybe I should produce another podcast, Fen, about beauty and what a psychopath looks for in beautiful things. Well, actually, I suppose I'm doing that, just with other aspects of my life. She was like a child in a sweet shop. She ran around the room from piece to piece and admired particular items that she found interesting. It seemed she was sort of ingratiating, although she did seem genuinely happy in her explorations. Seeing her love these things was nice, but then she would touch and paw them and streak her fingers over surfaces that were polished to a mirror finish and ruffle the delicate fabrics that covered my seats. This hurt and made me remember the real reason why she was here. I showed her through to the kitchen, stainless steel and dark wood. As she moved around the room, nosing through each cupboard, I perused the wine selection I held in this part of my home. What was she worth opening for? I looked at her. I needed to choose something, a French classic maybe. A fruity red would go well with Kim. A bottle of vintage Petrus. It grabbed my eye. I looked at the girl again. I compared her to the wine in my mind. A moment in quiet thought. Yes, I believe she's well worth it. As I reached for the bottle, Kim had made her way to the kitchen's back wall. I'd been lost in my wine selection as she'd reached for the door of my large cold room where I store my meat. I noticed in the nick of time and had to shout her name to get her interest. She looked shocked at my abruptness as she turned towards me. She'd unclasped the door and partially opened it, and I saw that the light had awoken in the store. This night would be short and dull if she entered, and she saw the contents. "Would you be interested in a glass of wine by any chance, Kim?" I asked her, showing her the bottle in my hand. She smiled, closed the door and walked back towards me in what I presume she thought was a seductive strut. She came very close, placed a finger on my shoulder and asked if I was trying to get her drunk, so I could take advantage of her. I smiled and dropped my head somewhat shyly as though I found this embarrassing, while inside my head I revelled that I had saved the moment and the night. It was a semi-shame that I could not show her the hook where her carcass would hang. I said nothing more but presented the wine rack to her. "Select anything you want," I told her. She started to lift the carefully stored bottles and check the labels. I soon realised she was no wine aficionado and became quite concerned by her handling of my very expensive bottles. To my utter horror, she showed me one by just holding it with one hand, and that hand was on the neck of the bottle. "You fucking cradle these things like a human cradles a fucking newborn." She was talking, but anger burned in me and I had to quiet it before I could listen and continue. I took the bottle gently from her like you would take the newborn from the hands of a drunk uncle, and gently returned it to its cosy nook. "Sorry, Kim, I missed what you said there. What was it?" "I was saying that I buy wine by choosing from the labels. I like wine with animals on them," she said. I was genuinely disgusted. You buy wine by the labels?" I repeated. "Yes, and buy if they have animals on them," she giggled. "Probably not the correct method of choice, but I find it works for me," she laughed. I was momentarily stunned into silence as she wandered off and started to play with my Italian stainless steel washer taps. Maybe a Petrus was a little above Kim's pay grade. Perhaps something with a fucking animal on the label would work. Right. Flashback over, back to the room. She sat in the seat as I looked for my required items. I took one loop of silken rope and returned to her seat. I made my way behind her and admired the view in the mirror. I looked amazing, a creature of power overlooking his prey. Another mind photograph for the memory. God, do you know what? I wish I'd filmed this piece of work. Much of the art I produce is in the process, and the sad thing was that no one but me would share this. "Raise your hands," I ordered. She lifted her arms from her lap and raised them above her shoulders, where I grabbed her wrists and brought them together above her head. Her flexibility and strength was so apparent in the act that none of these movements were forced or a struggle. Her eyes were fixed on mine as mine were fixed on hers in the mirror. I gave her a wry smile and a nod. She smiled back at me. She wasn't permitting me, but giving me an acknowledgement that she knew what was expected of her. I looped the rope 3 times around her proffered wrists, taking it between the wrists at the end to secure the quick tying with a reef knot. It was a practice technique and a joy in its simplicity. Shibari can be time-consuming in practice. Some like this in their rope play. They see beauty in complexity. I see mine in simplicity and effectiveness. The least work needed to be effective. I returned her arms to her lap as I lowered the ring from the ceiling. I passed the rope through that ring and returned it to its point on the ceiling. I took the rope in my hands and started to pull. Oh, at this point, another flashback. We stood and chatted for a while in the kitchen as we discussed the day and the wine. She liked my 1974 911 in the garage, and I told her the story of its finding and rebuilding. Well, most of it. I left out the gore and guts bits because I didn't think that was appropriate. Finally, my glass was empty, as was the bottle. She casually leaned her back against the worktop, cradling her glass in her hand. I made my move. I walked directly towards her and stood before her as I placed my glass behind her on the surface. I was eye to eye, the wolf and the lamb. She held her glass before her, offering me some resistance to my approach. I smiled, looked at the glass, removed it from her hand, and placed it next to mine. Her hands dropped to her side as she now looked up at me. Her face was open, and no thought beyond this moment crossed her sweet little mind. I leaned forward slowly and gently touched her lips with mine. No more than a moment of touch before I lifted my eyes to meet hers once again, to see if this is what she wanted. I could see in that moment it wasn't what she wanted. It was what she needed. Now I took my lips to hers once more. The kiss was much more. It was hungry. Her hands slowly lifted, but she couldn't touch my body. I took her in my arms, one around her shoulders and one around her waist. I brought her to me. She felt the strength in the moment, and she held me back. I soon felt her relax, and then resign to this intimacy. We continued to kiss for some time. It was passionate, and she became more and more animated and rushed in her actions. Her breathing rate increased, and the energy of her passion grew. I took my hands down to her waist and forced her away from me, again holding her with my eyes. She looked momentarily angry at the ending of the kiss. She reached to her lip with her left wrist and wiped them with it. I held her and just looked at her. She was gently shuddering in her want. I could feel her shake. To my wolfen senses, the smell of her want was so apparent. Hormones flooded her body as she prepared for it. For this, I lifted a finger to her lips and placed it on them. With the other hand, I took hers to lead her from the kitchen to my room. Flashback over. The rope slowly ran through the ring and became taut against her wrists. I paused and smiled my approval. I now continued to take in the rope, which brought the hands from her lap to above her head. I anchored the rope to a cleat on the floor as I walked behind her and gripped the back of the chair. I took the knotted rope around her wrists and lifted her to her feet. She tried to turn to me, but I held her head and pointed it at the mirror. She knew what was expected and returned to look at the scene. I moved the chair to the wall and rested it there before returning to the cleated rope to continue the process I had initiated. I pulled on the rope until she was on the point of balance. The weight taken by the rope and the weight taken by the floor was about even. Her strength was now so apparent as the muscles in that well-trained body came under some strain. This was delicious. This moment, click, another mind picture. Ha! Another flashback to mess with you. I took her to my room. The room was dark when we entered. I closed the door and led her to the bed. I knew she was blind at this point. My vision was evolved for the night. Hers, as a simple monkey, was not. I sat her on the bed and pressed the switch for the single spotlight above the bed. It was light enough for the stage we used for tonight's performance. She sat on the edge of the bed as I looked at her. I could see she was trying to think through what to do, but I took charge. I held her hand and made her rise from the bed. Once she stood before me, she tried to speak. I stopped her once again with a finger to her lips. Her mewling was incongruent with her beauty, so it had to be stopped. I held her hair on the back of her head and pulled her head back. None too gently, I must admit. I felt a moment of fear and tension pulse through her body. It soon went as I placed my mouth on her exposed neck. I did nothing but just leave it there, holding her head for a moment. I had my eyes closed and spent this time enjoying the fragrance of the creature I had in my grasp. It was all mine. She smelled of youth and stale sweat, animalistic smells that this wolf greatly appreciated. I felt my mouth moisten as I salivated. It took every ounce of will not to bite deep into what was offered, to tear into the flesh with my human teeth and let her life flow into mine. I now offered her a kiss to the smooth, fresh skin and got a deep sigh as reward from her lips. I laughed for no reason. It was amusing me. Taking my head from hers, I released her. She stood transfixed before the beast, and I wandered my eyes up and down her lithe body, eventually resting on her eyes. I leaned forward and kissed her briefly before unzipping the overlarge hoodie that consumed the flesh I wanted. I took my time, never taking my eyes from hers. Once undone, I took the hoodie from her and threw it behind the bed. She wouldn't need it anymore, so who cared? I knelt at her feet and gently lifted her socked feet from the floor, carefully removing the white cotton. The blood there spiked in my mind for a moment, but I fought the animal back and continued. Once the injured foot was unmasked, I raised it to my mouth and kissed the damaged part, looking up at her. The taste was undefinable. The finest wine the earth proffered would never touch the slightly acid iron taste that I held on my tongue. Once the socks were gone, I returned to standing to remove the tight t-shirt that she wore. I lifted it at the waist, and there was this ungraceful point where she had to wiggle with her arms above her head to allow its escape. I returned to a position where I could look at her. She folded her arms across her chest and dropped her chin as though shy. I lifted her chin with a finger, taking it away and wagging it at her. She got the obvious body language and dropped her arms to the sides. Then, grasping her shoulders, I turned her so she presented her back to me. I lifted the old stained sports bra from her body, sniffing the pungent material for a moment before again casting it away to one side. I pirouetted her body 3 times to face me once more, removing the arms she now used to conceal her breasts. I again looked her over and nodded my approval at what I saw. She was perfectly proportioned. I went to the hips and took hold of the waistband of her jogging bottoms, slowly taking them down to her feet, where I lifted each one from them. I returned both hands to her waist, taking hold of the soft white cotton of her panties with both hands. I remained kneeling before her as I drew them down. I had to close my eyes as my olfactory sense was battered by the released odours of her sex. I think it's a shame that you poor creatures are robbed of these senses to the degree you are. So much can be learnt from the simple sense of smell. The scent was heady, better than any perfume you could name. It was the musky scent of, well, sex. She again lifted her hands to cover herself. I smiled and removed the hands with mine, giving them a squeeze of reassurance. "Sorry, it's a bit uncared for. If I'd have known," she began. I smiled at her, releasing one hand to my lips in a call for silence. She stammered to a halt. I now looked at my prize. Taking her hips with a firm grasp, I pulled her towards me, where I buried my mouth in that sweet-tasting succulence. She was now on the edge of dangling on that string from the ceiling. Her toes were touching and she struggled slightly to maintain her stance. I returned to the rope and lifted her about a foot from the floor. I knew at this point she would submit herself and relax. She did. Her face was bliss as she started to rotate with a natural twist of the rope. I returned to my store of good things and picked up a large plastic sheet that was at the bottom of the wardrobe. I brought it into the room where she tried to see what it was as she slowly span. I rolled out the plastic on the floor beneath her, smiling broadly as I did so. The spinning form slowed to a stop, and I positioned her once more so that she could see herself in the mirror. I stood in front of her. I want you to see all of this, I told her. She nodded. What a fucking idiot. Fen walked through the wall of the room to join me. He's my wolf soul. Told you about him already. The werewolf part of me. Invisible to all but myself. When we wolf out, he joins me to be the werewolf. I stopped watching because fucking Spike's in love with Buffy. What absolute hocker shit. He'd never do that, he said. He then looked at her hanging, and a smile, toothy, wolfy smile passed. Were you doing this one together, Will? He asked. No, I think I want to do this. You can watch though, I said. Cool. I could tell he was slightly disappointed, but I wanted this one alone. She closed her eyes as I retrieved my roll of butcher's knives from the store. Rolling it open, I chose a sharp paring knife. It was high-quality steel and sharpened to the finest edge I could achieve. I took the knife to her and touched her thigh with it. Her eyes sprung open and she tried to look down at what was on her. She couldn't quite see the cold metallic blade. This was a shame. So I showed it to her. Panic began. She started to scream and swing wildly on the rope, looking around the room for help. Fen looked almost disappointed. Has she no idea that there's no one here to help her then? Fen asked. Obviously not, I said. We stood and watched it panic. We sat and watched the fear energy burn in her. I bet she shits herself, Fen said. I don't think so. I'll take that bet, I replied. Eventually the screaming stopped as she ran out of steam to continue. The violent swinging also fell back to gentle rotations on the rope. I moved forward, ready with my tools. Unlike other animals, it is better to start gutting a human at the sternum, not the pelvis. It's easier not to damage the stomach that way and ruin a lot of the meat. As I got closer, she started to wail again and scream, "No!" I stood before her as she did this wailing, tapping the knife's blade on my teeth. I was getting somewhat impatient and angry. When are you going to realise there's no point to your fucking pathetic screams? I asked her. No one's coming. No one can hear you. Fuck's sake, just shut up. Stop moving and let me prepare you. That just set her off again, the selfish bitch. I went back to the cupboard and got 2 more ropes. I attached her ankles to cleats on the floor so she could no longer spin or move very much. All through this she begged and moaned. She kept on saying her safe word, red, 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 red. It was doing my fucking head in. I eventually slapped her hard across the face. She became silent and limp. She wasn't especially hurt by the slap, but seemed cowed. I know, not a very gentlemanly thing to do, but sometimes you get pushed too far. I'm sure you understand. I checked the ankle restraints before getting back to the task ahead of me. I know I should have killed her before doing it to make it simple, but where would the fun in that be? Again I stood before her, her eyes now lifted to mine. Pleading was in them. I pressed the tip of the knife to her sternum, getting a tiny pinprick of blood. I took it on my finger and offered it to her, thinking she'd be disgusted. Amazingly, she licked it from my finger with her tongue. That was unexpected but exciting. I kept focused on those amber orbits as I slowly pushed the knife into her chest. She grimaced, but did not let out a sound. Her eyes were full of hate. Good, I told her. It's all good. She nodded. I placed my finger into the incision to push the stomach and the liver away from the abdominal wall. We didn't want to poison the meat by nicking them. As I pushed those fingers in, she gasped, just as she gasped when I penetrated her that night. Keeping the organs away from the blade, I slowly slit down the centre of her abdomen to her pubic bone. She shook, screamed and shivered as the blade cut. I knew it was sharp, so it wouldn't be too painful. Eventually the knife touched her pubic bone and she passed out. She wasn't dead. I was sure of that. I quickly reached into my roll of blades for the smelling salts. She wouldn't escape this as easy as that. Unscrewing the cap, I placed it under her nose. She awoke immediately and then started to scream like a veritable banshee. How I had done the cutting meant the diaphragm and thorax was still intact, so she could still breathe, even though her abdomen was open. I also had not damaged any of the major blood vessels or organs. She would die, but it would be slow if I left it at this. It may even take an hour or two before the body responded to the damage. Again, I watched her voyeuristically as she fought. She didn't seem to know she was dead yet. At this point, I should offer you some more advice to stop the meat from being poisoned by poo or acid. Get yourself a pull saw with a knob on the end. This way you can cut your way through the pubic bone quite quickly without damaging the guts with a sharp tip. I can only imagine what it was like to feel the saw cutting through her bone. The pain must be so extreme. It must be the greatest of sensations that anyone can experience. With 6 quick cuts, the blade was through the bone. Blood flowed a little, and her chin dropped again. Another waft of salts, and then again, a screaming woman. Now I knew the next bit had to be done very quickly so she would get the full effect before she went. I opened her abdomen so that I could see where the diaphragm met the walls of her body. Once this was removed, she would suffocate as she could no longer be able to bring air into her lungs. I only had minutes to do the rest. Luckily, I'd practiced this a lot. I sliced the diaphragm away and then quickly cut up her sternum to her throat, pushing my fingers into the neck to pull out the trachea and the esophagus and held them in my hand. The wrenching brought gurgling, silent convulsions. She was still alive at this point and her eyes settled on mine for a moment. Horror and betrayal were in them. No hope now, though. She'd given herself to me. I ran the blade behind the esophagus and pulled it towards me, slicing through it and the trachea quickly and cleanly. She gurgled, and a thin red foam came from those tender lips. The last step. I reached into her abdomen, taking one high grip and one low grip, and pulled. The guts fell out onto the floor. At this I roared in my ecstasy, an orgasmic moment as the flesh slipped in my hands. Every muscle tensed as I squeezed, crushing what I held. I was now panting, sweaty and bloody as I calmed down the beast inside me. I had to see it. I had to look at that face. I looked up and smiled. The eyes were still showing life. It was fading, but it was still there. I raised a bloody hand to my mouth and blew Kim a sweet kiss. Thanks for listening.